Professor Habib, thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this interview on your new book, Hegel and Empire. Can you please first tell us what made you pick up this topic, which is not entirely new?
Okay. Well, thank you for asking to do this, Thorsten. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that there's a lot written on Hegel and on his alleged racism and Eurocentrism. But I felt that one of the things I could do in this book was to write maybe from a more nuanced perspective, where we acknowledge Hegel's bias, Hegel's undoubted bias, but also maybe show how Hegel himself shows a way forward beyond these Eurocentric biases.
Yes, one of the terms that struck me most in this book is the idea of the concrete universal. Can you please explain what that means?
Yeah, well, maybe I could use a couple of examples that Hegel gives himself. So, for example, the idea of God. Okay, we know, and I think later on we'll probably talk about how Hegel views the Islamic concept of God as abstract. But for Hegel, so God is not some kind of abstract, universal, beyond our world, but God inheres in its particulars. So God is embodied during the process of human history, and God is actually an evolution or a process. Another example that Hegel gives is the idea of personality. Okay, when we talk of a person's personality, again, this is not just something abstract, but it doesn't exist anywhere. The notion of personality does not exist anywhere outside of a person's actual actions and behavior that's manifested. Another example we might give is perhaps in the notion of justice or law, again, which is not something abstract, but it's embodied in human institutions and in human behavior.
Yeah, so maybe we can bring these two things together. You were talking about racism. Does this approach via the concrete universal make Hegel less racist?
No, I don't think it makes him any less racist. But I think what we could say is that maybe Hegel contravenes his own methodology at times, so that he doesn't always follow his own dialectical method. So, for example, when he regards China or Asia or Africa as having no development, I think that strikes us as being very undialectical.
Yes, another thing that struck me is your relationship with postcolonial theory. Most postcolonial theory, and you mentioned that, sees Western metaphysics, or at least Enlightenment, as the equivalent of imperial domination, or even as racist. You don't agree with that? Do you come from another tradition, or how do you explain this distance that you keep towards those theories?
Yeah, towards post-colonial theories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Thorsten, that I would describe myself as disagreeing. I think what I would say is when we look at the Western philosophical tradition, For example, you could cite statements of John Locke or David Hume's essay of national characters, or Kant's essay on the beautiful and the sublime. I think there are definitely elements of racism there. But on the other hand, people such as Russell Berman have pointed out that we can't regard the European Enlightenment as something monolithic and say the whole thing is racist, because there were people such as Voltaire who pointed out the hypocrisy of many European thinkers. So I think the Enlightenment itself is kind of fissured in that way, But also, I think another important question is when we identify certain philosophers as having made racist statements, are those racist or Eurocentric perspectives, are they integral to their thinking, or could they be separated from their thinking? I think some people think of Hegel's racism as integral to his thought. And I guess I'm one of those people who think it's probably not.
Of course, Hegel does not say anything true in his description of this pure religion that is looking for absolute truth. Those things he says in the philosophy of history. This is not a good characterization of Islam, but on the other hand, it's a good description of what we recognize today as fundamentalism. God as a pure substance that is reduced to an empty absolute without any concrete predicates. Is this, what Hegel describes there, not exactly what is happening today?
Yeah. So if I could just address the first part of what you said, was that it's not an accurate portrayal of the Islamic God. Now, inasmuch as, what I would say is that inasmuch as the Islamic conception of God is transcendent, I would say Hegel is accurate, because there's no kind of intrinsic connection between God and man. But on the other hand, it's not true that the Islamic concept of God is only abstract, because, for example, in the Quran, it talks about the 99 beautiful names of God, right? So, for example, the all-merciful, or the powerful, or the all-aware. And, those are all kind of, I guess you could say they are projections of human qualities. As Aquinas said, we don't really know anything about God. The only way we could describe God is in terms of qualities that we know, right? But in terms of fundamentalism, yeah, I think I would agree with you, and I think you had mentioned before about Olivier Roy, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm anticipating.
No.
But you had mentioned about Olivier Roy and how he, for him, perhaps the defining trait of fundamentalism is its diremption from culture. It's absolute kind of separation from its embedding in culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of sympathy with that definition, because I think one of the things that fundamentalism does is to posit the state of the pure religion, which never actually existed. And so fundamentalism is very, very ahistorical. It doesn't actually go back to real history, I think. It posits a time when there was this kind of purity of faith, purity of conception, which is really really a myth. And I think that purity is the same thing that he's kind of talking about, isn't he? When it's kind of torn, when religion is torn from its cultural context.
Can Hegel help us today to regain a more reflective existence? Hegel criticized the lack of reflection in culture, not just in religion, but in science, in philosophy, in many other domains. Today things are too direct, too purist, lacking self-consciousness. Hegel speaks of our immediate, simple, unreflected existence. Can Hegel help us today to find a way out of this purist, unreflected existence?
Again, of course, it's very difficult to generalize, but I think what we can say is that for Hegel, the dialectical process begins with a negation of the given. So whatever is just given to us in the world, we can't just accept that as a reality. And so, I think in that sense, Hegel's dialectical method shows us a way forward, in as much as, for example, if I am simply born into a given religion, right, then I don't just blindly follow it, blindly accept it, but it's in a sense it's my rational duty. It's my duty as a rational being to examine myself and my beliefs, all the things that I was, all these situations that I was born into, and in a sense we often need to transcend the given, transcend the circumstances that we were born into. Actually, this is what Simone de Beauvoir says about the condition of women, right? That they should, she uses this Hegelian terminology, and she says that women should not be imprisoned within immanence, within the conditions that they were born into, and that one of their existential duties, if you like, is to transcend that givenness and go beyond, to go beyond conventional conceptions of what a woman is, right?
Mm-hmm. What do you think of Hegel's treatment of Hinduism? He says that they too are steeped in the divine, in the absolute. What is your comment?
Yeah, well, Hegel's basic problem with India is, again, that his conception of the divine is very abstract, and that conception of the divine is embodied very indiscriminately in all kinds of material things and all kinds of natural objects. And so, for example, you get, according to him, you get gross distortions such as gods with many arms or legs or whatever, and so that's his basic criticism. But his other criticism, I think, is that the Indian conception of the divine is very kind of passive, and I sense that what Hegel is doing really is imposing Western philosophical and aesthetic categories upon his reading, for example, of the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, we all know about the bourgeois work ethic, right? And that's very important to Hegel's philosophy, the idea that we find the world as it is given, and through our labor we work upon the world and we transform it. And in the process, we transform ourselves. And that's fine. But I think what Hegel overlooks is that the notion of work in the Bhagavad Gita is something very different. You know, in the Bhagavad Gita, work is something to which we, from which we are detached, and we don't actually invest ourselves in it. And so we detach ourselves from the world. And I think that's basically what Hegel's fundamental problem is. He doesn't like a philosophy or an ethic which calls for complete detachment of ourselves from the world. It goes directly against the whole thrust of modern Western developments, if you like, as embodied in Hegel's thought.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You have another book coming out on Hegel?
Yes, it's called Hegel and the Foundations of Literary Theory. It's coming out with Cambridge this year, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you very much for having taken the time to talk about your new book here today at Gast in Kuwait, and good luck with your research. Thank you.